Good morning. I'm Richard McNamara, and I have the opportunity to interview William S. McGraw, who retired this year after being the clerk of the Merrimack County Superior Court for 25 years, and who before that served as the deputy clerk of the Hillsborough County North Superior Court, although it was just Hillsborough County Superior Court back then.
It was.
And it's a privileged interview, Bill, and thank you for being here and taking the time to talk with us.
Well, I'm flattered and delighted to be here.
I guess what I wanted to do is I wanted to start by asking, who's Bill McGraw? I mean, you're a fixture now, which is a horrible thing to say about somebody, but who's Bill McGraw? Tell me about where you grew up, your parents.
I was born in southern Connecticut, in Milford, Connecticut, and lived there with my parents for 6 years, and then moved to Trumbull, Connecticut, across the Housatonic River into Fairfield County, and spent my years of early schooling and high school in Trumbull. My parents were older. My mother had been married once before and lost her husband to leukemia just before World War II, and my father was older, and they both worked at Singer Manufacturing in Bridgeport, Connecticut. She was a telephone operator, and he worked in the precursor of data processing, and worked for perhaps an office romance resulted in a marriage, and I was a result of that. My mother was actually raised in a Swedish-speaking household in Reading, Connecticut. Her parents worked for the Gilbert and Bennett Wire Works, and were met at Ellis Island by Gilbert and Bennett representatives who took a liking, or they wanted to have Swedes working there, and they liked their work ethic, and so her parents came to Reading, Connecticut, in a little area of Georgetown. She never had a education beyond beyond middle school. Her parents died in the flu epidemic, and she ended up raising her younger siblings at the age of 13. So that was the end of her schooling at that time. My father did finish high school and went to work in Bridgeport, Connecticut, when his family moved there from Chicago. As far as I was concerned, high school was an interesting time for me. Typical adolescent struggles and angst, but survived it, and went on from there to college. Well, my first attempt at college.
Well, you have sort of an unusual career path, and I wanted to talk about that. You went to college for a short time, but then you left.
Well, I was asked to leave, actually. I was right out of high school in 1964. I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. I had some inkling that I wasn't really ready to do much of anything. I even realized at that point that there was a maturity level that needed to be attained before I could, before I felt comfortable really settling down, or could even look to put together a plan or work on an ongoing career path. So I started at the University of Bridgeport in Bridgeport, Connecticut, as a commuter student in 1965. Lasted one semester until I was asked not to come back because of I guess my highest grade was a C in accounting, and that was the shining point of my career up until that point. Of course, this was in 1964. I flunked out in 1965, right at the first stages of the build-up for Vietnam War under Johnson. In the fall of that year, I actually went to work at a department store. In the fall of that year, the Tonkin Gulf Resolution came in, and it was Johnson's first major draft build-up, and I was caught up in that. I had my draft notice when I was still 18, although I wasn't inducted until I was 19. Was set to be inducted on the 22nd of December 1965, but I asked not to be inducted 3 days before Christmas, so they delayed my induction until the 29th. So I reported on the 29th of December 1965.
Now, I know that your Army experience was a seminal experience for you. It changed you in many ways, or made you in many ways the person you are.
It gave me an opportunity to grow up, which I desperately needed to do. I needed to gain some maturity. I needed to gain some experience, and I guess if there's a way to do it, that's certainly one way to do it. As I said, I was drafted, and went to Fort Dix for basic training. Ended up with an upper respiratory infection, so I was in Walson Army Hospital for 5 or 6 days. But that set me back in my cycle. So when people did testing, I wouldn't go with a large group of inductees. I was able to go through the testing process on my own. And so the person who was doing my IQ testing allowed me all the time I wanted. And so according to the Army, I had an Army IQ of 184 because I had 3 hours for a 2-hour test and was able to complete it. But so that probably helped me somewhat on my record and working through different areas in the Army. I went from Fort Dix to from basic training to training as a radio operator. Learning Morse code and learning those things that you needed to do to be a radio operator. And in learning and studying a bit more about what the life expectancy of a radio operator was in a firefight in Vietnam, it seemed to be that it was less than 15 seconds in a firefight was the life expectancy for a radio operator. So I wanted a little better odds than that. So I just jacked up my studying a bit and was able to go on to a radio teletype operator school in Fort Gordon, Georgia. And from there, that's what I spent my Army career as a top secret cryptographic radio teletype operator.
And now the Vietnam War was raging, but you got through that and you got out of the Army, and then you came to New Hampshire. Now, how did you come to New Hampshire, Bill?
Well, after serving in Korea, which is where I was sent for some reason not to Vietnam, my cycle of trainees went through Germany and Korea. The cycle before me and the cycles after me went to Vietnam. It's a matter of dumb luck. No matter where you were, you would read the Stars and Stripes, the Army newspaper, and the first thing you'd look at was a list of casualties from Vietnam each day. And more and more familiar names would appear, people I got to know during the training period, and people I also knew from growing up in Trumbull, Connecticut. Friends, relatives of friends, neighbors, and the toll increased and mounted and became, well, as it was for everyone in the country, it became a real burden and a real sadness to anybody who was involved in it. I served my time in Korea, did well, made sergeant after 16 months. My service commitment was for 2 years, but I came back to the U.S. with less than 90 days left to serve, and so as opposed to reassigning you, they processed you out. So after serving 21 months and 8 days, I was released from my active duty requirement and went back to Trumbull, Connecticut. And it was pretty clear to me by that time, for what I had seen and for those I had gotten to know, that I wanted to do more than work in the department store I had worked in previously, and it was time to take life seriously and to get back at college, give it another try. I went to my high school guidance counselor, because it was the closest asset I had right there in the same town, and started looking at schools. And one of the schools I looked at was New England College in Henniker, New Hampshire. My high school guidance counselor said, there's a representative who's going to be visiting the area. I'd like you to talk with him. So I did, and we got along well. The interview went fine, and I was offered acceptance, or I was requested to apply, and after application, I was accepted.
And so you did attend New England College in Henniker, which really became, in many ways, a focus of your entire adult life, Henniker, New Hampshire.
That's very true. I can remember my now wife, Darby. At the time, we wanted to travel to see where, by that point, we were engaged to be married, and we wanted to see where we would be spending some time. She was finishing up her degree at Michigan State, and during the summer before I started in 1968, we took a drive up to New England College, and it was after coming from a relatively busy area of Connecticut and driving into the small town of Henniker, where there were nothing but dogs walking on the street, and every building was white with green shutters. It was a bit of a early New England shock to us. I can remember pulling around in back of the administration building and seeing a sign there, and it said reserved for president in a parking space. And I turned to Darby and said, "It's got to be for Lincoln," because it's it was another century. It was totally out of somewhere else. So that's how I ended up there. I started in 1968 and finished, of course, in 4 years.
And you were involved in student government while you were at New England College.
Yeah, I took the opportunity to make a better run at college than I did at the first time. So I figured, well, I had the maturity, I had the experience from the service, and the exposure to a lot more than I had previously. And so I figured, what the hell, if it's out there, we're going to try it. I was applied myself to my studies. I actually made straight A's throughout school, except for 2 courses that I was initially given incompletes in because I was hospitalized with it for a while. But outside of that, everything was straight A's. I graduated with the highest academic score of anyone in the school. But I also saw an opportunity to mold some of the practices and to perhaps rectify some of the, I'm not going to say injustice, but some of the inequities that were evident. This was the 60s. Colleges were moving from in loco parentis to allowing a bit more freedom to students, and so I wanted to be a part of that. I ran for and was elected to the Student Judiciary Board. I worked with as news director of the college radio station in its organization and during its first broadcasts, and also was elected president of the Student Senate, which is the governing body of New England College at the time.
And then you went to law school.
I did. I learned through school and through some of my earlier experiences that inequities and unfairness bothered me greatly. Whether that was the racism and prejudice I saw in the service, whether it was the favoritism and bullying I noticed in high school, or whether it was the inequities of the Vietnam War and the way it played out on the lives of many Americans and seemingly a very unresponsive government. And in order to do that, I, of course, as I said, was involved in student government, but also beyond that, I should say that within 8 days of returning from the Army, I was demonstrating against the war. And those sentiments certainly stayed with me and still stay with me today. But I saw law and the practice of law and government as a way of hoping to address the inequities, of being in a position that would allow someone to level the playing field, to make sure that decisions were based on tenets and provisions that were just, that people were given a fair and equal chance based upon the issues before them, not upon some preconceived notion as to who they were or what the government wants, but upon the tenets of fairness and equality.
So you chose to go to law school right here at UNH. Then it was Franklin Pierce Law Center.
It was. I decided after after a couple of years, I graduated in the economic downturn in 1972. Jobs were not too plentiful. I worked wherever I could and knew I wanted to do more than the menial jobs I was in. I did work for a while for a newspaper and ended up for a brief while as editor of a small weekly newspaper in New Hampshire, which I seriously enjoyed, but knew that was not going to be my career, and applied for law school during that period. I applied to several schools in Boston and to what at the time was Franklin Pierce Law Center. It was in its second year. It was of just working towards its accreditation, and I met with the folks there, and I liked the feeling of the school, the individual attention, the informality yet high quality instruction, the sense of teamwork. And not of competition among the students, but of cooperation among the students, and that appealed to me. And I was accepted at least one school in Boston, but I decided for many reasons that I was going to stay here in New Hampshire, where my wife and I had found a home and enjoyed it, and would stay here in New Hampshire for law school.
Right in Henniker. I mean, Henniker's been a big part of your life. Was that a part of the decision for you to?
It was part of it. I mean, obviously the convenience of not having to move and relocate into Boston, but we really loved Henniker, and we loved the New Hampshire way of life. Very different from what either of us were used to in a busier southern Connecticut. The sense of community, the fact that people in town know you. They know you by name, you know them by name. There's a community, a real community. It's not a commuter town. The people living there, you get to know people of every age group. You see life, death, birth, the continuity of a community, the changes, the things that remain the same, the love people have for the town, the spirit they have in bringing to municipal activities and participation in the town, and that really appealed to us. And we liked where we were. In fact, we liked it so much that we've never lived in another house. We had initially rented an apartment and a house in Henniker. It went up for sale, and we purchased it, and still live there today. So that's part of the reflection on why we enjoyed the town to the extent we did.
And when you graduated from law school, you went to work at Hatfield and Henderson, which was a small but extremely well-known firm in that part of the state.
Yes.
How did that come about?
It was interesting. I got to know the newspaper I worked at was the Hillsborough Messenger, so I got to know a lot of the people involved in the town of Hillsborough back at that time. People like Don Napton, Doug Hatfield, Dick Withington, people who were very much part of the town of Hillsborough. And being from a neighboring town, Hillsborough was a bit larger, so they had the law firms or the smaller law firms that Henniker didn't. They just had a branch office of Perkins, Douglas, and Brock. But I approached Doug Hatfield and asked if I could work there part-time, more or less as an internship in my final year of law school. And he was very receptive and very kind. They allowed me to work. They actually paid me for the internship, and they also allowed me to study for the bar exam as part of my job, and it was done on the assumption that perhaps I would join the firm when I graduated and passed the bar. So it seemed like a very good fit to me. It was a general practice. Doing anything from some minor criminal work to divorce work to estate planning, some litigation, and everything seemed to give me what I wanted. It seemed to be a good balance and a good exposure to many areas of the law. Because at that point, I knew some of the courses I enjoyed, but I did not really have much in mind as to what area I wanted to emphasize and where I wanted to focus my practice.
But your practice, you were representing individuals, people.
Yes, and most of them were people I knew,
in small towns.
Which was a small town practice. Part of our practice, we did a lot of municipal law, a lot of school law, a lot of work with zoning appeals and town meetings. And so town meeting time and school board meeting, school district meeting time were very, very busy because we represented a good number of towns throughout the area. And so I did a good deal of that, which was interesting to see. I actually, put together some village districts for areas that wanted to separate. Did an awful lot. At the time, attorneys did title search. And so as the low man on the totem pole, I was assigned to the Merrimack and up in Newport and Sullivan County, as well as in Hillsborough County, Registry of Deeds. I spent a good deal of time doing title searches there, and so that was very much part of my practice as well. It's just as far as the bar exam was concerned, this was the of course, everybody angsts about the bar exam. I can remember that studying well and studying hard for the bar exam. Clearly, I figured, well, at the time my wife was pregnant with her first child. I had a job that was contingent upon me passing the bar, and I figured, well, what the heck? The previous class, which included Franklin Pierce's first graduating class, the bar exam had a pass rate of about 87%. And I figured, well, I'm a good student. I test well, so I didn't really worry about it too much. And then when the results came out and the pass rate was 54%, it just broke out in a cold sweat. But fortunately, I was part of that 54 and was able to continue on. But there are a lot of people I knew who did not make it that first try.
So after you liked practice, I gather?
I did, to some extent. Yeah, I did. I love the community aspect of it, the dealing with individuals, the helping people through problems. That aspect of it I liked a great deal. Being a small firm, you were occasionally thrust into things that you weren't that comfortable, into areas far beyond your comfort zone, which I'm sure happens in large firms as well. But being in a small firm, there weren't necessarily many people who were experienced in the area. I became the tax expert because I was the only one who had read the Tax Reform Act of 1976. I became the federal courts expert because I was the only one who had ever read the federal rules. So that's not much of a background for either of those to be thrust into the middle of some relatively weighty cases involving both of those. And so there was some part of it that was a little unsettling because of, not for lack of caring of the others involved, but for the lack of wider experience in a specific area that you would certainly find in a larger firm with a great more practitioners than a three-person firm.
Well, at some point you made the decision, I guess it was early on in your career, it was then a somewhat unusual decision to enter public service.
Yes, it was part of it was caused by some extent the discomfort of going into things without a lot of background on it. And I'm a person who likes to know what's going to happen, and I like to be well versed in the situation and to represent a client. Of course, to the best of my ability. And I felt I wasn't able to do that for a couple of reasons. One, that I didn't have a great group of individuals with great experience in areas to draw on. But more than that, I felt that my personality was more of one that would look for a solution to a problem and not be a zealous advocate. I found it much more appealing to try to come to a solution that will work for everyone and to work towards common ground and to trying to deal with everyone fairly and equitably. And that isn't necessarily what the practice of law is about. You represent your clients, you do so reasonably, but you do so zealously. And the zealous part is the part that I would be more likely to try to find a reasonable solution than go into it with fangs bared. And so I actually answered an ad in Bar News for a deputy clerk's position in the state of New Hampshire. At the time, the state of New Hampshire was trying to hire as deputy clerks and clerks individuals who would make that their career and not use it as a stepping stone as it had been to private practice. And that fit well with my plans. And in 1980, I interviewed for several positions. There were two positions open, I believe, one in Cheshire County and one in Hillsborough County for deputy clerks. And I was lucky enough to be selected for the one in Hillsborough County. And Don Goodnow, who of course is now head of the Administrative Office of the Courts, was selected for the position in Cheshire County.
It seems as if in the early 80s, 1980, there was almost a changing of the guard. It seemed as if there were a lot of young people who came in and went on, you and Don Goodnow and John Safford and Ray Taylor. Can you talk about what it was like, what the culture of the court was like when you got there, and how it changed by people like you with the experiences you've just told me about?
Well, Richard Dunphy, Chief Justice, is his idea to bring people who would act as court administrative professionals into the system. At the time, there were clerks who had been there for a great deal of time and were approaching retirement. Bob Rich, Sam Samaha, Bob Murphy, many people who'd been there for quite a bit of time, and the court was looking to have some competent professional continuity to the administration of the court. It was an interesting time to go in. There were changes, certainly changes taking place in the country in the early '80s. There were changes in administration, the way things were handled. They were handled, starting to see a much higher, substantial increase in growth of dockets, and the access to the courts. Things were backing up. Things were becoming clogged, and there was things were still being done the way they had been done for years and years and years, for decades. I can remember, and it was sort of telling. Here I was, still relatively idealistic, coming into to work on the first day, the first week, and thinking. My first reaction was, these courts are being run for the convenience of the judges. That's not what we're supposed to be here for. These should be run for the convenience. Again, a very naive position, but they're being run for the. They should be run for the convenience of the people and to move things through expediently and allow them access to the courts as the Constitution requires. That sticks with me very clearly to this day, that first impression that something was wrong and something had to change, and the changes were starting, and that I could help with those changes.
What kinds of things, when you think about, this is 35 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there were no computers,
Yep.
there were no fax machines, there's no email. How were things handled compared to the way they're handled today? I mean, it's hard to articulate that question. Maybe you can.
They were handled in some ways less formally, which was good. As far as the relationship between the bar and the judges and the court administration, there was more contact and there was more familiarity. There was also smoking everywhere you went. But
Right.
files pleadings were triple folded, all dockets were handwritten. Things really were the way they had been done for close to a century. Things were entered by hand or if you're lucky, by typewriter, and things just were not moving as well as they should. You would find cases languishing for 5 to 7 years without a trial, and there was concerted effort to do that. I can remember we would have no backup of the files. There was nothing, and in all honesty, we still don't. But I believe the Church of the Latter-day Saints came in and started microfilming court records. And as far as I know, the only reason Hillsborough County got got a backup microfilm record was because the church, the Mormon church, made 2 copies, one for themselves and one they gave to the court or the entity that allowed them to photostat. And so things were done relatively haphazardly without any concerted effort at uniformity or statewide organization. That was until 1983 when the Unified Court Act came in. And the courts, which were superior courts, which were still county courts at the time, each county funded them. They were under the general auspices of a Chief Justice, who was the state Chief Justice. But the individual policies, the individual pay, the individual organization, the facilities and everything were simply a matter of individual county governments and funding statewide. There was no continuity, no uniform process, or no uniform way of handling matters.
So that 1983 legislation made a big difference in the courts?
Yep. It's been an incremental change. Some may say now that the uniformity is too great, that there are differences that should be accommodated, but for the most part it's been a change for the better. I guess it was January 1st, Act was effective, I believe, January 1st, 1984, and it made it a state court, funded by the state, run by again, the Chief Justice and the Superior Court Center, under the control, the ultimate control of the Supreme Court, and things started, I think, to improve greatly from that point on.
You know, talking about the 80s, when you were a deputy clerk in Hillsborough County, there were a lot of changes that you probably saw. The composition of the bar changed. More women came into the profession.
Yep.
How did that affect the operation of the courts?
I don't think it really affected the operation of the court. It probably affected the attitude of some of the people on the bench and some of the other lawyers. You hear some snickering, referring to people as lawyerettes and the like. Some problems with, gee, is this still my brother at the bar? And is it my sibling at the bar? Is it my sister at the bar? And but I think for the most part, and I saw women enter the practice probably more on the prosecutorial side in the county attorney's office, more than it seemed to take a little while longer before the litigators, the litigation positions were opened up to women. But as far as the competency of those practicing, it was clearly extremely competent individuals practicing regardless of gender. Also at the time, it was a time when more women were just started to be named to the bench. I worked initially in practice. When I was in practice, I appeared before Justice Delanus, who at the time was a marital master. And when shortly after that, when she was appointed to the bench, I worked with her very closely in Hillsborough. And that was a time that was probably the biggest step in gender equality in the bar, or step in that direction, was her appointment and her work. And she had a very hard time because she was the test case, being held to a standard that no one else was, and she certainly met that.
And she's now the Chief Justice of the New Hampshire Supreme Court. So yeah, I guess she met her
deservedly so.
And so you eventually came to be appointed the clerk of what's known in the system as the jewel of the Superior Court system, the Merrimack County Superior Court.
Well, I don't know about that, but it was fun.
And you were there for 15 years.
Actually, 25.
25? 25 years. Wow. So tell me, that's a very different court from Manchester, even though it's
very much so.
Superior Court.
Yep.
They're both. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, sure. Manchester was a very busy court, and I think it probably still is the busiest court in the state. Even with the county now split into two sections, very heavy criminal docket, very heavy litigation docket, civil litigation. It's a lot going on there. You've got a substantial amount of crime, and murder cases were, as far as they could be in New Hampshire, routine, and a great deal of time being spent on that. But Merrimack is different in a lot of ways. Concord being the seat of government brings cases to Merrimack that arise from government operations or government actions. So what you're seeing are cases that challenge and cases that involve very complex government issues, as well as, since we are home to the state prison, things that happen there end up happening in court, whether they be murder cases, or whether they be challenges to conditions, or whether they be habeas corpus petitions. And with Concord being the seat of the government, quite often when legislation is passed and initial jurisdiction or venue is determined, it's often for the convenience of the governmental entities set to take place in Merrimack County. I can remember at one time I was checking through the statutes, and there were at least 47 particular types of actions that either had to be brought in Merrimack County as the primary venue or the exclusive venue. So lots of things that happen nowhere else happen in Merrimack County, which is something that was new to me when I arrived.
And I suppose this applies to Manchester too, but particularly in Concord, when you're now the clerk of the court. Until I think the early 90s, judges rotated, so you had quite a mix of personalities coming in. And how did that affect your trying to administer the courts and see to it that justice is done?
Well, we did, and all throughout, in Hillsborough, when I was there for 10 years, and through the majority of my time in Merrimack, judges would red circuit. They'd be assigned usually not on a monthly basis, but perhaps on a 3-month basis, and move through. And one of the most difficult and challenging parts of being a clerk is working with the judges. Not that they're difficult to work with, although some are, but adapting to their individual styles, their preferences, and what really has to be done in those areas. What type of, how do you accommodate someone's work style? How do you accommodate their work philosophy, their legal philosophy? Do they use law clerks? Do they not use law clerks? How do they like their docket scheduled? And how does their schedule work during the day? Things like this greatly affect how you work. And so you would have to learn and adapt and then adopt your procedures to fit the wishes and the style of the judges who come in, who are very clearly very different individuals and who are used to having things pretty much done their way.
And so you had that to deal with. And then as the 90s went on, as you were in Merrimack, you began to see people who were self-represented. And that presented an issue for you.
There were always some people who were self-represented, but they were such a small minority previously. But that increased greatly. And in all candor, in Merrimack, later on in the 90s and into the 2000s, with the close of the state hospital, that ended up with a lot of people who would normally have been hospitalized being either homeless or in halfway houses or on the, living in the streets in Concord, in sheltered housing. That also highly resulted in a great increase in the number of self-represented individuals, and actually individuals who were representing themselves and without great ability to do so. But self-represented individuals who challenge government actions, which is quite common. If they're going to challenge a government action, that's usually done in Concord. And at the same time, back then, Superior Court also handled marital cases. up until probably 7, 8 years ago, and the vast majority of those marital cases, I think it was 70-some%. I did some statistical work on it. Involved at least one side that was self-represented, and so that's the majority. The vast majority of cases include self-represented individuals. In the most difficult cases, people can represent themselves in, and that, in and of itself, was a real challenge, statewide, certainly, not just in Merrimack, and resulted in many attempts to try to simplify the system, make it easier for people to represent themselves, at the same time trying to assure due process.
But your background and the reason you went to public service led you to be very involved with the people who came to the court just looking for help. You can talk about that a little, how your philosophy of what you did, and maybe talk a little about some of the people who would come in and what they would ask for, and how you dealt with them.
Yeah, you realize that most people no one comes to court because they really want to. People come there looking for the redress of grievances, or to answer a problem they have, or to address an issue they see, and they walk in and it's a different world. Everyone's speaking a different language for the most part. They don't know the rules, and it's a place where there's a high degree of anxiety for everyone who comes into court, whether you're a practitioner or not. So I try to view people or try to address and treat people the same way, no matter who they are. They should be treated with respect. They should be welcomed. They should be helped. They should be greeted with a smile. They should be made to feel at ease as much as possible. And I think that works well for them, but it certainly helps the court in a great deal. I would, if someone has an issue, I would try to sit down one-to-one. Obviously, you can't do this with anyone, but if someone is having a real problem, or if someone isn't getting the answers or doesn't understand the answers they're getting, I would leave the protection of the glass enclosure, go out and sit down next to them in the lobby, engage one-on-one, introduce myself, and just try to explain what's going on, make sure they know that I can't advocate for them, but I'm there to explain the process and to try to make them feel at ease as much as possible. And that carries on to in the courtroom, whether you're talking to a self-represented individual, you're talking to a criminal defendant, or you're talking to a prosecutor or a defense counsel, or any litigator, or juror, or visitor. They're treated with respect and deference. Everyone, it goes back to my feeling that everyone should be treated fairly. When someone walks into that building, that's neutral territory. They shouldn't be, regardless of what they're accused of, regardless of why they're there, they should be treated with respect and deference. And that's a policy, and that's a feeling I've tried to engender in the staff that works at the court, and that's carried over, I believe, into the security staff as well. We've had many comments of how thanking people who work there for the way they've been treated. It just works to everyone's advantage. It lessens the level of animosity, the level of confrontation, and has a great deal to do with providing a secure place. Because when people are treated with respect, they don't see the court as an adversary. They see the feeling that they're being treated well, the feeling that this is a neutral place where they will have a say, carries over and diffuses, we know for a fact it's diffused many possible serious incidents.
Well, you were recognized many times for the way you interacted with people and the way you treated people. You were Merrimack County Lawyer of the Year a few years ago. And I guess as I hear you talk about this, Can you tell me, is that a change that you think has been throughout the Superior Court, through the culture, through your time at the court, the way the court approaches pro se litigants,
Yeah.
lawyers generally?
I think what I've done is just a matter of my personal style, and the things that I see are important. And I haven't observed. You're busy in your own court. You don't necessarily go and observe how things are happening in other court locations. However, there have been policies that have been put into place to try to make it easier for people, and I think there's a systemic addressing of some of those issues. A lot of it, some of it through the Superior Court, but other ways through the relaxation of some of the stringent requirements for pleadings and the like in the circuit courts as well now. I think there's a realization that there are a lot of self-represented individuals. My concern is that with the number of cases, particularly in circuit court, that can be lost because of the intensity of the docket, the fact that there are thousands and thousands of cases that have to be addressed, and they can't be addressed on an individual basis, and there can't be time spent with each individual. Well, certainly there can't be that much time spent with each individual in Superior Court, but that somehow that feeling of attentiveness, that feeling of respect can be lost with the necessity of dealing with a great number of cases with a small period of time. But I think there is an awareness on the part of the administrative judges and the administrative council that there is a need to treat people that way, and systemic changes can be made to enable that.
Over your 25 years as the clerk of the Merrimack County Superior Court, can you think of, there have to be memorable things that stick out, changes in the way things were done, or things that happened that had a profound effect on the court. When you look back on your 25 years of being the clerk of the court, what do you think of as some of the turning points, some of the points where things really changed one way or another?
Well, most of the change has been gradual. I think that the biggest change, of course, is data processing. The biggest change is the computerization that you see from docket control that used to consist of reading a docket card all the way up to centralized processing where an individual in the call center can call up any docket and see what's happened on any case statewide. That certainly is probably the biggest change we've seen. It's a two-edged sword. The ability to provide information is great. However, that information has to be accurate, and that information is generated by individuals, one case at a time. And so dockets have to be immediately up to date if the information that's being handed out from a central area is going to be accurate. But I think that as we are still working into that area, the fact that you're getting arrest warrants that are instantaneously issued nationwide, things like this really speed things along and make the court more efficient. However, getting caught up in small areas of the practice, or excuse me, of that area of data processing is something that can happen, and you sort of spin.
Well, in the years you've been at the court there, I'm sure there have been many memorable cases, just memorable things that have happened. You look back on it, 25 years at Merrimack, and even going back to, I guess we can go back all the way back to your practice. What sticks in your mind, Bill? All the things you've seen, all the sound and fury of cases coming and going, and then...
Yeah. There are a couple of incidents, of course, that usually the ones that stick out are perhaps the worst, the bad ones. There was an individual who tried to escape from custody in Hillsborough North shortly before Christmas in the mid-'80s. And he was in the middle of a trial. They finished the state's case, and they were going to start the defense case in the afternoon. And he, in handcuffs, was able to get away from the bailiff who was with him and exit the building. And as he was running towards downtown Manchester during Christmas season, he was shot by the deputy sheriff. And I clearly recall that, and looking out the window of Judge DeClerico's chambers and seeing him laying in the snow. And that's something I will never forget. He did survive, but just as an aside, I had the duty of informing his public defender, and this was her first case, that not only had her client been shot over the lunch break, but that the judge had ruled that he had voluntarily absented himself from trial, and trial would continue following the lunch break. You know, you remember things like that. You remember an individual who was convicted of a relatively minor, a simple sexual assault case, surreptitiously swallowing a cyanide pill in the courtroom, and within moments collapsing on the floor. These aren't the usual things you see. Again, that had a good result, as good as can be. He was immediately attended to by not only his attorney, but the bailiff staff, transported to Concord Hospital, and was up and walking the next day. There are things that stick in your mind. The fact that dealing with Carl Draga at the counter, Carl Draga, who had gone on a shooting rampage in the northern part of the state, killing a district court judge and shooting others, appeared at our counter the day before, wanting to file an action challenging the actions of the judge in the northern county. We said, no, you had to bring that in the county where it was situated. We couldn't take in an action challenging somebody else's decision, and we all know what happened with that. More recently, things that stick in my mind is coming home from shopping and getting a cell phone call from my wife saying that the Concord Fire Department was at the court and there was smoke in the building, and then turning around and heading back in to find 4 pieces of fire apparatus and an 1.5-inch hose line going in the front door of the courthouse, and just dealing with those issues.
And as I recall, you had the court up and running in a day.
We did. We missed about half a day of hearings, but it was smelly, smoky, wet, but we carried on, and not only that, the Sheriff's Department, who received heavier damage than we did, they did as well. So
and that was one thing you always did. The court was always open.
It should be. You know, it's this isn't a branch of a store. This is the Superior Court. This is where people turn to redress grievances, to be assured due process, and to make sure that that entity, that part of the state, that part of government is running and open and accessible at all times. It's extremely important.
Bill, you've been recognized by your peers many times for your hard work, for your dedication to professionalism, to really having devoted your life to public service, because you really have, and the accolades have been many through your career. As you look back on it all, how would you like to be remembered? What do you think your legacy is, presiding over the courts, 25 years at the Merrimack County Superior Court, through tumultuous times in our nation's history and our state's history? How would you like to be remembered?
I would like to be remembered simply as someone who tried to make the court accessible to people, to try to make it a friendlier place to come, a more welcome place to enter, and a place that was clearly run for the benefit of those who come to the court to redress grievances.
Thank you very much, Bill. It's been an honor to have the opportunity to interview you, and thank you very much.
Oh, you're entirely welcome. It's been a pleasure. as well for myself as well as to work with you as much as we were able to.
Yes, that was a pleasure. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Perfect.